lot of time here with my kids when they were growing up, just hanging out in the Chicano Museum. So it's kind of fun to come back and be here in a different kind of venue. Wasn't really sure what to call it. Playing around with different titles. And if any of you are historians, you know, like this is kind of a false question. In the ancient world, Astronomia and Astrologia were synonyms. They both kind of refer to the same stuff. So it's kind of a fake, but I hope you'll see why I brought this up as we go through the topic. All right, so we're going to start off with the Dresden Codex. This is the one manuscript that we have, hand-painted hieroglyphic manuscript from about the 13th or 14th century that people have tied their understanding of Mayan astronomy to. It's screenfold manuscript, so both sides are painted on, and they have content on each side. What I'm looking at lately is the handwriting, because you can tell there's different scribes in it, and there's different scholars who have identified 5, 6, or even 7 different scribes contributing to this manuscript. So it's really the work of a group of folks coming together to paint this manuscript with some agenda in mind. And we want to get a little bit of what their agenda may have been. I'm stealing this image here from Bonampak. It's not really from, it's actually from about 300 years earlier than the manuscript itself. But it gives you a sense of what these folks would look like, these scribes, these nobles coming together to write this text. And where would they have been? Probably at Mayapan. That's the most likely source for the Dresden Codex. Mayapan is a really fun site if you get the chance to go. It's not too far outside of Merida, which is the capital of the Yucatan Peninsula. And it's great because nobody goes there. It's totally empty like this. But it has replicas of all of the kinds of things that you would want to see if you went to Chichen Itza. So there's the circular temple, which is a replica of the version at Chichen Itza. And then the four-sided pyramid, which is the temple of Kukulkan, also shows up at Chichen Itza. So you can have a lot of fun there and nobody will mess with you. So you can kind of imagine these folks at Mayapan creating that manuscript. That's around 13th, 14th century. Then, we know, Spaniards arrived, burned a lot of books. We lost the ability to read these texts. So all of this understanding of what was going on in them fades back into history until this gentleman, Ernst Furstenmann, at the end of the 19th century. He comes across this document in the Dresden Library. It's been there for about 100 years already, just sitting on the shelves. And he says, hey, I used to do some math. Let me see if I can figure out what's going on with these numbers. Because he realizes that others have talked about these as potentially showing a numerical system that was unique to the Maya. So you have the bars, which represent 5, and the dots, which represent 1. And he said, hey, you can do some fun things here. So let me blow it up so you can see it in the back. This is hard to tell, but there's a bar at the very bottom. So there's 3 bars here and a dot. Right? So that's going to be the number 16. So there's 16 here, and there's a number above it. So we know it's not a base 10 system. It's not a decimal system. Like, what's going on? First one was like, hey, it could be that it's base 20. And if we're base 20, then you have 16 in the ones, and you have 11 in the 20s, which gives us, I heard you guys are all physicists, so you can tell me that's 236. So we'll have 236 here. Then 4 in the 20s place and 10 in the ones place gives us 90, yeah? And then 10 in the ones place and 12 in the 20s place. 250. See, like, my students do the same thing. Like, where's my calculator? Right? Where's my phone? Right? But then nobody has math in their head anymore. All right, and then this one is fun because it's 8, but then above it is this football shape, which is my representation for 0 in the codices. So, adding these together, 236, 90, 250, and 8, you come up with...
Oh, that's asking way too much.
594.
584. And so Furstenmann in the 19th century is like, 584, that's very close to 583.92, which we understand is the synodic period of Venus. So all the way back in 1894, he was like, this is a record of Venus. And these pages are giving us a charting of Venus observations over time. That happened at the end of the 19th century. So you can imagine, early 20th century, people started going nuts. they started seeing astronomy everywhere in Mayan culture. They're like, look at the structures, it's aligned to solstices, look at these complexes of temples, they're aligned to sunrise and sunsets at particular parts of the year, and so they're finding it computationally, and they're finding it in orientations, and the next thing you know, the Maya are obsessed with time, the Maya are all about astronomy. And that perspective is what we still hear echoed today. And it came from the fact that Ernst Forsman was reading the numbers and ignoring the text, right? He couldn't read the hieroglyphs, he could read the numbers, so he based his entire interpretation on patterns in numbers. And one of the reasons I start with this is because I want us to think about what it takes to get at an understanding of an astronomy in an ancient culture. Is it just saying, oh, it's kind of what we know, but it's a little bit different, it's got some flavor, it's got some spice, or do we have to rethink how we think about astronomy in order to get there? And so the way I like to do this is by thinking about the work of this guy here, Carlo Ginzburg. He's an historian of medieval and Renaissance Europe, and my favorite book that he's written is The Cheese and the Worms. If you ever want to read just something fun about ancient times, this is a great book. He talks about cosmology as it was represented within like popular communities in Italy in the 16th century. That's not what I'm talking about today, though. It's his earlier work called The Night Battle. And this is a super fun book. It's about the Friuli region in northern Italy, and he's talking about this strange occurrence that shows up in the archives of this region. What he finds is that there's the record of a priest who goes into this small rural village, and he comes across this guy who tells him that his son was just healed by a local, not doctor, but a healer of some sort, a traditional healer. And he says the way he did it was he realized that the son was cursed, and so he had to remove the curse, and he could do this because he was a benandante. And so the priest was like, what the heck is a benandante? What does that mean? The guy says, actually, I'm a benandante because I go with the others to fight 4 times a year, that is during the ember days, at night. I go invisibly in spirit, and the body remains behind. We go forth in the service of Christ, and the witches in service of the devil. We fight each other, we with bundles of fennel, and they with sorghum stalks. That's what it means to be a benandante. You're going at night in your spirit form, and you're battling witches. And you're not using swords and like clubs and stuff, you're using bundles of fennel and sorghum stalks. So the priest is saying, what the heck does this mean? What is going on? This does not make sense, but it doesn't sound like it's proper. So he summons him to the Inquisition. Right? So he has to go before the Inquisitor and say, what is it that you're actually doing? He tells him this, and he says, actually, it's got important ramifications. If we're the victors, if we use our bundles of fennel and we defeat the witches, then there's going to be a great fertile agricultural year. But if we lose, then there's famine. So he isn't just doing this because it's fun, he isn't just doing this because he's tripping out at night, he's not just going in his dreams, there is an actual repercussion to whether they win or lose. So he explains this to the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor says, I don't know what to do with this, send this guy home, forget it, we're not going to take care of this. And so he goes away. In the records, it tells us there's no consequence. Until another priest comes in 5 years later, and they say, this looks a little bit fishy. So we're going to bring this guy back. They bring him back to the Inquisition, and they bring another guy who says he's doing the same thing. And what happens is they start to change the narrative. From the story that he initially talks about, which is just, going out and battling witches, all of a sudden, he starts to confess, through torture and other means, that there was actually the devil present. And actually there was an angel present. And actually the angel was just the devil in disguise. And the next thing you know, this whole thing that had just been some random tradition in a rural village becomes part of demonic Sabbath encounters and witchcraft. And so this guy goes from being a healer to now being persecuted by the Inquisition. And it's because the Inquisition only has one way of understanding what's going on in this non-Christian space. So what Ginzburg is doing with this story is he's telling us that there's this transformation, or rather closer to the truth, a superimposition of the inquisitorial schema on a pre-existing stratum of generic superstitions. These superstitions don't make sense to the church unless you convert them into something that they do believe in. You have to turn them into something else for the Inquisition to believe them, and then there are consequences to that, right? I'm arguing that's very similar to what happens with Mayan astronomy, right? Keep this in mind. We have this record that looks like astronomy, so we put our astronomy glasses on, and then we just see astronomy everywhere. It doesn't mean that that's what they were actually practicing, but our hegemonic view of what astronomy and science should be turns it into that, right? And so what we do is we sometimes, epicycles upon epicycles, we create all kinds of crazy stories to make these things make sense in the science way, when really we just need to take those science classes off. And so for this, I appeal to the work of Michel Foucault, historian, post-structural philosopher, and when he's looking in particular at the history of madness and civilization. What he's doing is he's saying, don't worry, we'll get to astronomy pretty soon, right? We need this foreground, okay? So what he's doing is he's saying, let's look at how we think about madness today, how we think about non-reason. Okay? And what do? We think of it in a medical framework, right? They need to be in an institution, they need to be taken care of with pharmaceuticals or something, right? How did that come about? He goes back into archives as well to look at France's records in the 16th and 17th centuries, and he sees that there's this moment when earlier madness and reason kind of coexisted, right? Madness could have many different flavors. Sometimes it was a madness that came out of spiritual enlightenment, out of religious transformation, right? Madness could be something other than just being crazy or being unstable. Right? There were different forms of madness and they coexisted with reason. But there becomes this point when reason takes over and reason itself gets to say madness is not okay. We're going to put you in hospitals. We're going to confine you. We're going to move you into these other spaces, and it's reason that's making this decision without consulting madness or non-reason itself. And so what he wants to do, Foucault is interested in what he calls the 0 point. What is this 0 point before we make this move to split these things up? Right? What does it look like before we categorize? Before reason gets to tell madness what it is. And I'd like to do the same thing for Mayan astronomy. Can we go to the 0 point of Mayan astronomy to not already know what we're going to find and see what else might be there? And that's what we're going to try to do today by going back to the Dresden Codex. In particular, we're going to look at what they call the eclipse table. Why do they call it the eclipse table? Well, for one, the imagery kind of looks like it's telling us eclipsey stuff. This little image in the middle is what you recognize as kind of a flower, but it represents the sun. So you have sun, you have light, and you have dark. Maybe it's just night or something, maybe it's eclipse, who knows? We know there's an elaborate version of these glyphs that show up also in this text that do the same thing for the sun and the moon. So they're telling us like this lightness and the darkness of the sun and the moon. So the imagery might give us this hint, hey, maybe we're looking at eclipse. In order to go further, we kind of need to know something about how the Mayan calendar system works. So this is like an aside to bring you guys up to speed a little bit on the Mayan calendar. How many of you are familiar with the Mayan calendar to begin with? Okay, so we'll do this. All right, so there's there's a lot of different components of the Mayan calendric system. We're only going to focus on 3. You'll see another one later on, but don't worry too much about it. There's going to be the 260-day count, the 365-day count, and the long count. These are the symbols, the day signs of the 260-day count. The way it works is, we already know these, bars and dots, right? So the numbers 1 through 13, and those numbers serve as coefficients to the day signs. And then you just kind of increment each of them every day. So you would start off with 1 Imish, then 2 Ik, 3 Akbal, 4 Kan, 5 Chikchan, 6 Kimi, and you would go all the way through. When you get to 13, you start over again with the number, but you don't start over again with the day sign. It'll take you 260 days, 13 times 20, to come all the way back to 1 Imish. Okay? That's a 260-day count. A lot of fun stuff to talk about, but we only need to know how it works computationally for today. Right? It seems to be tied to this gestation cycle and people's names. That's all fun, but maybe we can get to that in question and answer. Right? 260 days. This is where Chuck stole my thunder because, right, like it's got the same kind of structure as we see in our weekday, right? So if you think of how we originally named these days of the week, they were related to the energies or the symbolism of the planets, right? That's what we're seeing in these day signs. They each have an energy or a personality. This is fertility, this is wind or breath, this is darkness, this is abundance. So they each have their own personalities, and then the cartouche is kind of like the suffix day. So it's imish day, it's eat day, right? So it's kind of carrying us through this 20-day period as opposed to the 7-day week. But keep in mind that they have those characters, right? Monday has a specific personality even to us now. Granted, it's overtaken by capitalism and not by astronomy, but Monday has a character, right? Similarly, Imish has a character, and they represent something about what people do and people interact with that day. That's a 260-day count, okay? So we use that. That advances every day. It works in concert with the 365-day count, which is much more familiar to us. It looks a lot more like our year. Only instead of 12 months, there's 18 months. There are 20 days each. And then there's one last month of 5 days. And then these all advance. So you have 1 imish, 0 po. And then 2 ik, 1 po. And then you keep on going through, and so you make it through. It takes 52 years for this whole thing to recycle. Okay, that's what they sometimes call the Mesoamerican century. This system was used throughout Mesoamerica, right? From like Sonora, from northern Mexico, all the way to Honduras. What's different about Mayan calendrics is that they nested that within the long count. So here you can see Mayan inscription, you see the 260-day count date, you see the 365-day count date, then there's lunar stuff here, and then above it, there's the long count. And this is what makes all of this astronomy stuff possible. Because what they're doing in the long count is they're just counting days. We can talk about like the nomenclature, but basically they're saying that this first period, peak, is of 144,000 days. So you have 9 of them. The second one is Wini Kab, there's 7,200 days each, so we have 15 of them. And when you get this long count date here, you're really just getting the number of days that have elapsed from some 0 day. This is a Julian day number, but it's assigned to a different 0 point, a different starting point. Okay? That allows you now to keep track of history and astronomy on a daily basis over time. It allows us to find all these really cool patterns, like the Venus cycles, and eventually, like the eclipse cycles. So let's talk about the eclipse cycles. They seem to show up in this, along with the imagery, and that's what Ernst Forstmann also figured out before the turn of the 20th century. So the way we read this is we will start over here, and then we read across the top till we get to this red line, and then we go back over here, and then we read straight across here. Okay? That's how this table is read. We're just going to blow up one tiny section, and we're going to explore it to see how it captures potential lunar phenomena. Okay, so we'll blow this part out. We'll occult the bottom because we don't want to worry about that yet. We'll focus on the top portion, and what we'll see is there's our day signs. They look a little bit different from the other ones we saw in the inscriptions. But that's because these are the nice carved ones, right? Where you have to carve them into stone, so you're taking more time with them. These are handwritten, so they're a little sloppier and messy. There's your day signs, and then below them are our time intervals. 8:17, I cheated and gave you the sum, so you don't have to do it in your head. 8:17 is actually 177 days. And then there's a whole series of those. You can see them all across here too. But then they often end with 7 and 8, which is 148 days. So these two intervals combined allow you to do some fun things. 177 is 3 intervals of 29 days, plus 3 intervals of 30 days. Right? You guys are seeing where this is going?
No.
148 is 2 intervals of 29 days, and 3 intervals. Oh, I just lost my iPhone.
No. No.
See, I was using it too much. I don't want to. I can use the point.
another one.
Right? So what are we doing? We're approximating the synodic period. Hey, I'll try not to burn this one out. I won't use this one that much. It's okay. So what are we doing? We're approximating the synodic period of the moon because we're saying it's almost 29.5, but it's a little bit more than that. And when you look at the approximations using accumulations of these numbers, you find that they get pretty darn close to what we think of as the synodic period of the moon. If you look at just hunks of this table, like just remember it was really long. If you partition it in certain places, it looks like you can also find the Saros cycle within it. And so now you're even getting closer to seeing something that's very much about eclipses in this table. And people like to do that. They like to go through and they like to say, oh, if you can kind of work with the numbers, you can match them up to some historical dates. But the fundamental problem is no one has found a way to take the events that are supposed to be eclipses and find a historical pattern that captures all of them. So it does not look like this can just be read straight through as a record of eclipses from Mayan times. What do? Well, you do what John Justison says. He just published this a couple of months ago in Science Advances, and he said, you know, if you squint a little bit and if you tilt your head a little bit this way, and you can find a pattern that looks like it works. And he then argues that this is the way they reconstructed, or this is the way they constructed the eclipse table. Okay, we can come back to that later, why it doesn't really work. But what I think is the take-home point, and this is not to knock John Justison. He's a great guy, he's an incredible scholar, linguist, and mathematician. But what he did was, I think, an egregious mistake. This is the eclipse table. Everything in blue is hieroglyphic text. He ignored all of it for his reconstruction. Right? So you can say, I mean, okay, yeah, there's a lot of numbers and there's a lot of dates, but what is the text telling us? Does it tell us anything about eclipses themselves? What does it tell us about what they were trying to do, as opposed to what we think we're supposed to see? And if you go there, we can read this now, right? Within the last 15 to 20 years, we've come to a very strong decipherment of the hieroglyphic text. Be careful, if you look at stuff from the late 20th century, there's a lot of speculation in terms of the readings of the hieroglyphic text. People were still kind of like, if you look at this dictionary and if you combine it with this dictionary, there were all kinds of ways that people were playing with reconstructions of hieroglyphic texts in the 1980s, 1990s. That all went away in the early 25, what do we call them, the aughts? 2006, 2010, when we really developed the grammar behind it and found it within the overall linguistic tree of Mayan languages. So the stuff published since 2005 is pretty secure. So we can read this stuff now. So we'll take a text and we'll read it. And it'll say, Kakuyaik, Nachan Ukagi Toro. And I'm sure you read that, right, Ronnie? With your class. Fiery clouds and wind are the first sky by the authority of Toro. Let's go to the next sentence. Pata chamal ubi chana. Death is formed on the road of the sky. Totally clear now, right? So it's like, okay, so what do we actually, maybe they're justified in not looking at the text, right? What do we do with this? Are they historical records? Are they predictions? What are they? What is going on in this hieroglyphic text? One thing we can say is it doesn't negate the possibility of them being eclipse records, but it gives us additional information that we don't know what to do with. People have complained about this for a long time. On the other hand, Gabrielle Vale and Christine Hernandez, a couple of years ago, they came up with this idea for reading the Dresden Codex and the Madrid Codex, where they said, hey, let's take this text seriously. And what we'll find is that there's a logic here. They say the codices explain the calendar and how humans should live to fulfill their obligations to the gods. And they reveal the structure and functioning of the cosmos. Okay, so that's why they're doing this stuff, because they're looking at the structure of the cosmos. They say mythic history, the need to incorporate myth into history, was necessary to the purposes of the scribes and the diviners, because the whole philosophy behind the ancient Mesoamerican belief system is that of cycles. You guys have heard this, right? Cyclical time, ancient Mesoamerica. What has transpired in the past is bound to repeat itself again and again. right? Here's the idea that they're saying, you need to look at the mythology because that's giving us the anchor of what may repeat in the future. They go a little bit further with this. One must know something of the past events in order to predict when they will recur and how they will recur. And what, if anything, should be done to prepare or take advantage of their coming. This is a red flag to me because now all of a sudden it looks like they're talking about science that we know about, right? You use these observations to make predictions, to master nature, to control nature. Are we leaning too much into what we think science should be to read this ancient science? Right? Are we just imposing our notion of science on what they're doing, but kind of throwing mythology in to give it some color? And what would Michel Foucault think about this, right? He's saying, what happened to my 0 point? What happened to going back? Well, we can actually find attestations of the interest in mythic history in hieroglyphic texts. This is from the classical period, this is from Palenque. You'll find that there's like this figure in the middle. See, much more elaborate than the codices, right? More care with their penmanship. Okay? So you've got a text here on the left and a text here on the right, figures in the middle. What we can do by looking at the dates is we find that this event occurred 931,000 years before this event. This is an event in historical time, and this is a historical figure. This is mythological. But the events are exactly the same. So they're planning to do this event in historical time. They're replicating what happened in ancient times. Right? That's not quite the same thing that Vail and Hernandez are talking about, right? They're saying things repeat. These guys are actually planning it, so agency. We can follow along and find another version of this at Palenque as well. Same figure, Can Balam. It's down here. Have any of you been to Chiapas, Mexico, seen Palenque? Great, beautiful site. Mexico did a great job of restoring that, so if you get a chance. Right next to waterfalls, go swimming, good tourist destination. See, I'm doing a commercial. This is my commercial break. In those three temples of the cross group, right, this is the cross group here, patronized by Can Balam, end of the 7th century. There's a tablet in each of those. And the tablet is kind of the same construct, right? Two figures in the middle, around some central piece, and then text on either side. What he's doing here has a parallel to what we know from European history, the history of astronomy. And it looks a lot like what Johannes Kepler was doing in the early 17th century. When he was like, hey, you know what? We know enough astrology now. We know enough astronomy to combine them and reconstruct the birth of Jesus Christ with these two forms of knowledge and computation. Right? So he's using the periods of the planets, he's using his new model for elliptical orbits to reconstruct what that date would have been for the birth of Christ. And that agenda is what Can Balam was doing at Palenque about 1,000 years earlier. And the reason we see that he was doing it is because of these artifacts. These are polychrome vessels that are often extracted from tombs. Most of these that we'll be seeing are looted, so they're on the private market. But Justin Kerr, in the 1970s, he got access to a whole bunch of them, and he did these roll-out photographs of them, so you can see the whole scene in one shot. Right? And these are all on mayabase.com. It's open to the public. You can just browse through a lot of these images, and they're fantastic to look at. So there's this one, but there are others that depict the same scene. Right? These are the current numbers here that give you the identification of them.
Gerardo, can I interrupt you? Who did you say Can Balam was?
Can Balam was the ruler, the Kukulahau of Palenque during the 8th century.
8th century.
Right, so we've got these different pots painted with similar scenes, but by different artists and for different patrons. Okay? So, what's fun about them is they have different dates. They're describing the same mythological event, but they're describing them two different dates in the 260-day count and the 365-day count. They are all consistent in having them on the day sign Muluk. So that's consistent. but the coefficients change and the 365-day count changes. So there seems to have been different traditions in different cities for placing these events in mythological time. And Khan Balam was like, well, which is the right one? How do we know? What Johannes Kepler was doing. Let's use astronomy. He and his Akuhuns, who were these noble scribes, they got together and they invented a new count, a new calendar count, the 819-day count, which allowed them to keep track of Saturn and Jupiter. They already had control of Venus, and they already knew how to do lunar and solar stuff, so they could now do a more sophisticated astronomical projection to look into the past and reconstruct events. So they used astronomy and numerology to reconstruct their myth history. And then they put these guys, these contested dates, into a new system, which is what we find on these texts. So these texts now give us mythology on this side, the history on this side, and they're connected by intervals, like whole number multiples of astronomical periods. They're reconstructing their past so they can plan their future. It's not exactly what Vale and Hernandez are talking about, but it's a way of using astronomy to bridge that gap.
Gerardo, can I interrupt you again? When you say the tablets, are these painted on a wall, or are these chipped into the stone on a wall, or?
Yeah, this here is the tablet that I showed you back here.
And these tablets are located
And
on a
these
wall, or are they?
tablets that are carved, large tablets, they're massive.
Okay,
They're carved and they're on the back walls of these three structures
okay, thank you.
in the costume. Yeah. Thanks for asking clarification. All right, where are we? Yeah? And if you're interested in the backstory here, this is subject of my first book. It's in paperback now, so it's not crazy expensive. But it's all about this guy, Khan Balam, and how he went through this astronumerology is what it's called. All right, so what are they actually doing here? It turns out, Diego de Landa, who was the bishop of Yucatan, and he wrote a book, Relaciones de las Cosas de Yucatan, in the 16th century, he gave us a description that seems to match what we just saw. His description is of the priests that he encountered in the 16th century, who were Mayan priests. And he talks about them this way. He says the Akim Mai, that's the high priest of the town that he was in, provided priests for the towns when they were needed, right? So he trained the other priests, examining them in the sciences and ceremonies, and committed to them the duties of their office, and provided them with books and sent them forth. Books, like codices, right? And they employed themselves in the duties of the temples and in teaching their sciences, as well as in the writing of books about them. Okay, so the sciences which they taught were the computation of the years, months, and days, and the festivals and ceremonies, what we just saw, right? So he's describing the same process that we saw inscribed into those tablets. All right. So on the one hand, we can look back in time to try and understand what's going on in the codices, right? That codex that we're looking at, the Dresden Codex, is 13th, 14th century. These tablets are from like the 7th, 8th century, right? So we can go back in time to get some better understanding of them. We can also look at the rest of what's in this document, not just focus on the eclipse table. Let's look at the rest of the content. And it turns out that of these 74 pages, these other chapters, most of them are almanacs, and they are not astronomical. So what's going on with those? Let's have a look. We'll start with a pretty simple example, yeah? And see how these almanacs work in most of the Dresden Codex. Are we okay on time? Yeah?
Yeah.
So, what we're going to see are these day signs on the left, right? We've got a column of day signs. Those look familiar? Now they're broken up though. These texts are only 4 in a group along with an illustration. And there are 3 of them, and then one text doesn't have an illustration. So these guys are all in sequence after this column of day signs. And the way we would read it is we would start off with the day coefficient up here at the top, 3, and that we would assign that to Akbala. Unfortunately, the day after Akbala is not men. and the day after men is not manik. So something else is going on to get from this day sign to this. Well, what can we do? We can just scroll across. What happens if we take 3 and we add 13 to it?
16.
These guys are just time intervals. So we'll take 3 above, we'll add 13 days, and we'll get 3 key. Here's the 3. They didn't take the time to write the day sign because there wasn't that much room. So they just gave you the coefficient. You add 13 again to 3 key, and you get 3 muluk. We're moving across. There are 4 13s, so there's 52 overall. So if we add 52 to 3 abal, we get 3 men, and now we do get here. So what you're doing is you're starting here, you go across, you get to the next. You go across, you get to the next. You go across, you get to the next. And you do this all the way through, you'll end up with 5 of 52-day intervals, and that gives you 260. 260 days is the length of the calendar round, so you can start all over again. So this is infinitely running, right? Every 260 days this thing happens. These 4 registers go every row, so there's 20 of those in each 260 days. That's a lot. What are you doing with all of that? Very early, in the 20th century, Richard Long, who was an astronomer who was looking at this stuff, said he understood how the almanacs work, and he said, in the Trocortesianus, which is another name for the Madrid Codex, there are over 200 of these almanacs just in that one codex. He says, even the Mayan priests, numerous as they are, could hardly have found time to celebrate ceremonies on all the days marking the subdivisions of these. So it's not just a calendar telling you, okay, on this date, do this, on that date, do that. It can't, because there's too many things going on. Nobody would have the time to be able to exercise all of that activity. Oh, we can go back to Landa. What did Landa say? He said, the scientists at the top were the computation of the years, months and days, the festivals and ceremonies, the administration of sacraments, fateful days and seasons, their methods of divination, and their prophecies. So maybe we should look at forms of divination and prophecy to understand what's going on in these almanacs. And we don't have to look very far. There's historical records going back to the 16th century, and there's ethnographic records, and there are Quiche Maya priests practicing the same divination practices today in the highlands of Guatemala. So you can go and you can verify it if you want. One of the best descriptions that I've found is the one by Barbara Tedlock in 1982, Time of the Highland Maya. What they do is they start off in the calendar priest, the Akik will have a big, huge pile of these red seeds. If you go to UCSB and you walk around at the right time of year, you'll see all these coral trees have dropped their little red seeds. Those seeds in the highlands of Honduras are called pite seeds. In the highlands of Guatemala and other parts, they're called site. And they're the red seeds that are used for this kind of seed sortilege. So you can collect your own seeds if you want. What the Akik will have a huge pile of these, and then we'll ask the person who's coming for the consultation, the client will come, and they will have to grab a handful of them. Right? They're not supposed to count out, oh, I want to get 17 of them or 42. They're just supposed to randomly grab a handful out of that pile. And when they do, that creates the stochastic element. You don't know how many are going to be in there. That's the randomness, right? But then the Akik will start to divide them into groups of 4 or 3 or 2, depending on how the math all works out, right? But they have to be placed into these groups, and that's the repeatable structure to this oracle. Yes?
So are people today using this?
Yes.
So it's not really looking at ancient records only.
No, that's exactly right. So one of the things that we're doing here is we're saying, how do we get at the perspective of a culture that existed 600 years ago? And one way is to look at historical records around them. Another way is to look at the surviving people from that culture and to see what they do, how they understand what they're doing. And so we're combining these different kind of triangulating an interpretation by combining experiences of indigenous people today with what we know about history and we can
Can
show.
Mayan people today read the hieroglyphs?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a move since the 1980s to take what we know here in the universities of the United States and Europe and make sure that it gets to the islands of Guatemala, to Yucatan, to Belize. There's an organization called MAM, Mayan for Mayas, and that's primarily what they do.
But they didn't pass it down from word of mouth to word of mouth.
No, and that's one of the things we're looking at, right? What are these resonances of culture? What are these things that you carry forward when you lose your writing system, but you carry them in other forms of knowledge production, right? And this is one of the things we're looking at. We're looking at prophecies and divination practices that could preserve some kind of resonance information. And when I'm talking about an oracular structure that I think gives it more than just a one-off. It's a structure that you can see in oracles across cultures. And so you need a repeatable structure, but you also need a language for interpreting what comes out of it. And what they'll do then is they'll say, okay, I've taken, you've asked me a question, should I give a talk at the Santa Barbara Museum? And then the Akik will say, okay, let's have a look. Take your pile of seeds, we'll count them out. We'll start on the day today, to Ben, and then we will just start counting. Each pile is a day sign. And these day signs are personalities, right? They're not just Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They're actually agencies in the universe. So you're talking to them. You're saying 3 Ish is like 3 Jaguar. You're saying there's a Jaguar energy here that may affect whether or not I have an interest in giving this talk today, right? This is going to affect the consultation. It'll end on 7 Etznab, which is the day like 7 Flint or 7 Obsidian, right? And that's telling us something about what I should expect. It's not giving me a yes or no answer, right? It's giving me a number with meaning. 7 is a middle range, so it's not extreme, it's not 1 or 13, somewhere in the middle. And then the day sign has mnemonic relationships. In Quiche, it's Tzichat, so there's all kinds of ways you can play with the word to get other interpretations out of what it's supposed to mean. It's not a yes or no. What it's doing is it's giving you a different approach to oracular information. It's not going to tell you, should I marry this person, yes or no? Am I going to be wildly successful in this next business venture, yes or no? It's giving you more information so you can think this whole project through, right? Now, is it possible that this is the same practice that shows up in the almanacs? Could we see a resonance between divination practices today and what's written in these codices? And I argue yes. You can see instead of 4 or 3 seeds per pile, you can just use the time intervals they give us. You grab a pile, a handful of seeds, you place them, and then you use these intervals. You count out 13, 13, 13, and you work through, and then what you'll do is you'll land on a very specific deity with description, and that should give you some information relative to the day sign and your prompt. If anybody knows tarot readings, it's kind of like that, right? It's not giving you a yes or no answer, it's giving you more to think about, right? This resonates, I think, cross-culturally with what we see in the I Ching. And so there's this guy, Tseki Hon, who is a scholar of the I Ching. He's got this text on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophies, where he goes through and he explains how Shu Shi understood the I Ching in like the 12th century. Right? What he's saying is that he saw the I Ching. You guys know what the I Ching is, right? It's like these little texts, hexagrams, okay? As a book of oracles, and encourage readers to develop mental dialogue with their hexagrams, right? He's not saying you just kind of place them and then ta-da, it gives you an answer. He's saying you're actually talking to these hexagrams as you're working with them. The advantage of this minimalist approach is that it is open-ended. It presents the voice of an oracle, and the inquirer must guess what is said and unsaid. In this minimalist reading, even an apparently undesirable line is not dreadful, because nothing is predetermined. And here we see the real break, right? Nothing, it's not that time repeats and all these ancient events are going to repeat, but it's that the future is unknown, and so you're trying to craft it by understanding what happened in the past. For him, for Shu Shi, self-cultivation is transformative because we as humans are able to make the right decisions if we are given the opportunity to consider all the options. But we don't often consider all the options because we're too wrapped up in what all of our concerns are when we get to that point, right? If you consult something like an oracle, it's going to give you something from left field, and that's going to expand the realm of what you might consider. Then you can consider all options, and then, according to Shu Shi, you'll make the right decisions. What does this remind me of? It reminds me of one of my favorite movies. Oh. You hear this?
You have the oracle? I'm sorry. I said, don't worry about it. I'll get one of my kids to fix it. How did you know? Oh, what's really going to make your noodle later on is, would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything?
Right, so it's not necessarily about giving you a yes or no answer. It's changing how you think about the experience that you're going through. And so what I would like to do is I'd like us to think about divination as a means of expanding the cognitive space for deliberation. Right? It's not about giving you some answer by tapping into some cosmic force of the universe that knows everything that's going to happen. It's about helping you as an individual move forward based on the questions that you have. And that would give us kind of oracular science in which you have the intentional construction of instrumentation via ceremony or ritual, like the seed sortilege, meant to expand the scope of cognitive deliberation. Right? You're trying to give yourself more ability to consider what the future might hold in order to make a better decision about what's coming up. All right. So if we return to the eclipse table, believe it or not, we came back. Then if we find a matching pattern, if we find a date that corresponds to an eclipse in historical time, we can go back and we can say, not that this is what's going to happen now, but that this is what we should consider. Right? We should consider the pattern that existed in the past and think about how it relates to our conditions today and what it might tell us about the future. What happened in primordial times is what we do with mythology. It's intended to guide us in thinking about what kinds of decisions we should make in the future, not telling us, not giving a recipe for what to do. All right? So they are using science and astronomy, they are using their understanding of eclipse cycles to reconstruct the mythology of the past, not just for the mastery of nature or the control of nature, right? It's about opening dialogues rather than controlling. And if you think about the way these cultures have been represented, you think about the scientific revolution and mastery over nature, the control of nature, the ability to dominate things to get them right in the way we want them, our resources, versus an indigenous perspective that says we need to find ways to dialogue with nature, to see how we coexist with it in ways that are meaningful. You can see that showing up in this kind of oracular practice. And it carries through a coherence to the whole Dresden Codex as a document, rather than seeing it as, oh, this is the astronomy part, this is the divination part, and this is the other part we don't know what to do. And this will bring us all the way back to the beginning with the Venandante, because now we're saying that if we're reading astronomies as Western science, then we may be erasing that original value that emic value that we have, because we're trying to make them look more scientific, right? And if we do go back and look at that 0 point that Michel was talking about, then we have a possibility of seeing Mesoamerican oracles as providing natural phenomena with agency. Right? Now the natural world has some way of speaking to us, and we can know how to move forward in a collaboration as opposed to a domination. So getting back to the beginning, if we call them pre- or proto-scientific, like saying that this is a pre-scientific astronomy, then we put them on a timeline, and we don't appreciate that there may be different ways of doing science entirely that are embedded with different cultural value systems. And that seems to me something that we could learn from today. Thank you.
Dr. Gerardo, you do take questions, right? You're gonna get some good ones. Q&A.
Okay, so all that stuff that was around those three fellas that you had up there,
Yeah.
that's what's kind of telling us what they're doing?
Yes. Yeah.
So what are they doing?
Good. So want to go back there? Let's go back there. This is a really fun.
The characters.
I mean, the short answer is read my book.
Ah,
But that's not fair. This is a lot of slides. I put you guys through a lot of slides, didn't it? All right, so here, like this, for example, yeah? Or did you want to see
There was three of them.
this one?
No.
the later ones where you had three characters
The
with
13 one,
Yeah.
by the 5, 5, 10, 13.
Oh, this one?
No.
Closer to the end.
towards the end.
I don't know what you got.
Keep going.
So we know
No.
Trump exists. He throws the stuff. So.
So these are great texts, right? This is a fun one because it's aligned with the cardinal directions. The first one is Lakin, so that's the east. So that, I can use my pointer. Right? So Lakin, and then Chok, Chak, Ahaule. So this is telling us this guy is Chak. That's his name right there. He's what we call the storm god or the rain god. He's a representation of Mayan storms. Okay? And it's saying that in the east, Chak, Chok. And unfortunately, we can't read what Chok is. We don't know what that verb means yet, right? But it's the same verb for each of them. So this is Sakishik.
So wait a minute now, so what is he doing now?
Yeah. So what he's doing is he's holding this right here is the glyph for tamale, right? So this is actually right because this is mainly what they ate before we brought in tortillas and this other stuff, right? So he's holding a tamal in his hand, right? We know that Chok has something to do possibly with like the beginning. So maybe in the east, his beginning of his meal is going to affect the rulership or leadership, right? So that's one omen connected to this illustration.
And
The next one,
he's a rain god.
and he's a storm god. Yeah.
Storm god. Okay.
And then, and so we could go off in a huge digression about like gods, why do we call them gods? And that's a translation that comes from Christianity because they're trying to demonize them all. So we won't go on that digression, but let's just keep God in quotes, okay? And then Sakishik. So Sakishik is connected to the omen of Hoshwil, which is a whole lot of food. And Sakishik is like white or crystal woman, right? She's a figure from mythological times. So she's doing that in the north. And then this is the sun god, King Ahau, there's his name. He's doing the same thing in the west. That's Chikin in the west. And this is related to just bad stuff. So whatever happened here is a negative one. Remember, negative things don't necessarily have negative outcomes because it's how you think about the whole context, but this is a negative only. And then the last one, they don't give us a picture, but this is the maize god right here. This is Ahan, and this is Utzil, so this is good stuff. And he's in the south, and it's also the same verb. So what would happen is you would go through and you would count, you would use your policies to move through this whole almanac, and then you would land on one of these. And then you would relate what you read and what they're doing to what your prompt is.
Thank you.
Great question.
Why do so many of them look, or all of them look angry? I don't see any character you showed smiling.
Yeah, that's a good
They're
question.
all very upset about something.
Yeah, I think they're serious. I think they're serious rather than serious. Yeah. But no, I mean, you'll see a lot of different representations of different deities throughout the codex. This is just one. Some of them are like 20 deities long, so huge diversity. I think I saw your hand, and then your hand. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. I think you're saying modern is kind of flattening what we thought they were doing. Is they're just doing science for science sake. But what you're arguing they're doing is trying to predict their future to bring more detail into their consideration of that future from past events. Not necessarily record.
Yeah, I'm trying to say it's a different relationship to the cosmos entirely. Right? There's the relationship which we have, which is to say, okay, there's resources out there on this planet, let's use them. Because we can do it, because we have control over them now. If we find lithium, we can find an application for lithium. If we find some new substance, we'll find and we'll use it and we'll do great things with it.
So the perspective is we consume the science where they're collaborating with their nature.
And they're saying this is a dialogue. We are on this planet with a whole bunch of other living things and non-living things, and we're not privileged to just say, I'm going to use that for whatever I want to. How do I give that thing that looks like it doesn't have agency, how do I give it agency? Well, if you can construct an oracle that gives it a voice, now you can gauge some way of communicating.
Their science wasn't cosmology, it was
Oracular. Oracular. Yeah, good. Question about that?
Yeah, a question regarding any dialects. Were these picture stories and numerology sort of constructs uniform throughout Mesoamerica?
That's a great question.
Or do they have, each region have their own way of interpreting this?
Yeah, so the only place we get to that level of universalization is with the Aztecs. The Aztecs were about empire, so they wanted to incorporate everything into their system. But that's not until the 14th century, right? Everything before then is very radically localized. People's cosmos was about their locality, their environment. That's what you cared about. So yes, absolutely, their mythologies varied from one place to another. And their languages, I mean, there's 42 different Mayan languages that are still spoken today, right? And so they have different ways of representing their mythology. But there are these threads that bring them all and give them that same Mesoamerican feel, which is distinct from what we see in North America, which is distinct from what we see in South America, like Inca, for example, or the Andes. So there is some continuity, but there's also diversity within it.
So the verb you said we didn't know what it means
Yeah.
up there. How do you know it's a verb?
So
And-
it's,
And
yeah,
the other ones that you, by implication, imply that you know what they mean.
yeah.
How do you know what they mean? Is that by guessing at what the figures are doing?
No, so there's actually, I'm going to cheat again. There's some great documentaries on this. Breaking the Maya Code is a wonderful book if you want to read the book by Michael Coe. And he talks about, I mean, there's a wonderful, it's a really fun discovery story about like, okay, you have these guys who were saying, this one champion of Maya archaeology, Eric Thompson, who's larger than life, right? He grew up on an Argentine farm, cattle rustling, and then he went to do archaeology, all this kind of stuff. And then he became the dominant voice in the interpretation of Mayan hieroglyphs. And he said, we won't be able to read them because they're ideographic. They're just images. You have to know basically the culture and everything about it to interpret them. And so he pushed that line all the way through the 50s and 60s. There was a Russian, Yuri Konorosov, who was working in Russia, wasn't able to travel outside of it, but he had the Dresden Codex. And he was a linguist. And he was like, these aren't symbols, these are phonetic elements. This is language. And so he showed that you can, what you have to do is you have to find different combinations of the same symbols in different locations, and then you can start to see that there's overlap and redundancy. And when you get those redundancies, you can say it's deciphered. In this case, we can say, I know this is la because I see la in other different places in other words, and it makes the same sound and it gives the same value. It gives us the meaning of that word. Here we can say that this is cho, and we can say that this is ha, but when we look in all of our dictionaries to find out what cho means, we don't find anything that works for us. So we're not clear yet what this means, but we know what these other words mean because we have that redundancy and we have our representation of them in language.
Well, the third one in there on the top kind of looks there.
Yeah.
Kind of looks quizzical, not angry.
There you go. Yeah, that's very nice. The question. Yes.
There are fascinating parallels to other parts of the world where they do something very similar. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, modern day Hinduism, or at least certain sections of Hinduism, where very careful attention is paid to the night sky, but within a religious context, and also to help inform decision making, which is almost exactly what you're talking about here.
Yeah. See, and this is what we have not yet done, right? So Mayan archaeology has really controlled the discourse of interpreting ancient Mayan civilization. And it hasn't always reached outside of archaeological bounds to look at comparative religions, to look at different traditions. And part of the problem is we keep on coming up with all these really fun, cool little tools, right? You probably have heard of all this stuff lately around LiDAR, right? So they go and they do LiDAR over the rainforest, it strips away all of the floral canopy, and now you can see the structures. So we come up with all these cool tools and people get distracted by that, so now they're gonna go dig more over here, and they do all of that work, which is important work, but they're not doing as much on the interpretation, which, so I totally agree with you.
Who figured out the number system, or was it a group effort?
The number system, in just in terms of ones and fives, that was all the way back to Landa, like 16th century. That stayed continuous. The positional notation, that was enforced around in 1894. Yeah.
Do you think if you start using AI might help you be able to decipher some of this?
Yeah, we've been playing a little bit with AI on this stuff, and the problem is AI like grabs from everywhere. So it thinks it knows more than it should know. And that becomes a real problem.
I've run into that.
Well, you can restrict it to only the
Yeah.
Mayan database, the Mayan information somehow. that what you're saying is we're grabbing from everywhere?
And I'm saying that there's also enough diversity within the scholarship that it won't know which to anchor to. So, yeah.
So actually, I'm just curious, so these, you said gods, not really gods, but in every culture that I've heard about, the sun and the moon are always like the most important figures. How do they appear in the Mayan mythology?
That's really fun because I think what I enjoy about Mesoamerican religions is that there is no strict hierarchy. And that kind of makes sense in these environments, right? Like sometimes we'd be like, yes, the sun dominates, the sun is the king of everything. But then a massive storm will come through and you won't see the sun for days, right? Who's really in charge during that? And so, yeah, sun and moon, you're going to see them in these codices all the time. But you're also going to see rain, you're going to see maids, you're going to see lords of the underworld, right? You're going to see, like, there's a whole diversity of deities. And there's no hierarchy. There are structural interactions, but it isn't a set, like, so-and-so listens to so-and-so.
I had heard that there's a story about the Mercury and Venus being brothers or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, so there's a whole set of, especially in Mayan communities, there are a lot of these stories that are variants on what we see in the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is what sometimes gets called the Mayan Bible. Don't call it that. It's the Quiche Mayan creation story. So the Quiche Maya, the highlands of Guatemala, they had a creation story, and this is their version of it. And it leads to, just like the Christian Bible, it leads to their own history, right? The history of the Quiche people. But there were also the Mam people, and there were also the Ixil people, and there were also, right? There's all these other Mayan peoples who had their own creation stories, and they were variations of what we see in the Popol Vuh. Sometimes it's the sun and the moon who are the twins. Sometimes it's Venus and the sun. So there's all kinds of variations. There's a great diversity.
Are there any star charts from this?
There's an argument. So the question is, are there star charts, are there constellations? There's an argument that one codex has a list of constellations, but it has given people fits because computationally it doesn't work.
There must be the Orion belt somewhere, the 3 dots.
So we heard about Seven Macaw, right? So there are some constellations that are recognized by Mayan communities today, right? That's Quiche Mayan. They say when they see the Big Dipper, they see Seven Macaw, which is a figure from the Popol Vuh. It's from their history. It's the sun before our current sun. But in terms of having like, okay, this is the set of constellations that Mayan people and Mesoamerican people saw, you don't have it.
Are there any records to show how they arrived at the orientation of some of the pyramids at Chichen Itza? Because they're very interesting.
Yeah, Chichen Itza is a great one. It's on the equinox. That's also in my book. That's in my my most recent book. So calculating brilliance, right? That's supposed to be in double entendre, right, with brilliant stars and also intelligence, right? That talks very much about the alignment at
So they must have been aware of the sky rotation and the orientation.
Absolutely.
That's the north, south, east, west.
Horizon astronomy, no problem. If you start talking about like spherical astronomy, you need to do if you're looking at like relative positions, that doesn't show up. Like trigonometry doesn't show up. There's a great book for those of you who are interested. Anthony Aveni, he's often called the godfather of archaeoastronomy. He wrote a book called Sky Watchers of Ancient Mexico. And that goes through like building blocks, right? Like if you don't know what eclipse cycles are, this is what eclipses are. If you don't know horizon astronomy, if you don't know naked eye astronomy, and he goes through all of that, and then he borrows from Mayan texts, Mesoamerican texts, to show examples of it. It's a great book. Yeah.
I'll just throw this in because I may have missed it. I apologize, Dr. Aldana, if you covered this, but it seems so simple. Are we just talking solar eclipses here?
That's a great question. No, it looks like, so there's this one sequence at the very beginning, I didn't talk about it at all, but there's an eclipse date, it seems like. Eclipse date, 15 days later, another eclipse date, 15 days later, another eclipse date. So you're like, well, what is happening there? Well, if you have a solar eclipse in the middle, and it's probably the middle. So it looks like they're tracking both. But nobody can figure out, like I said, what dates align with anything in the historical record.
The sun is involved, I guess the moon is involved in both types.
Yeah.
But the sun is, in the lunar, the sun just sort of throws the light and makes the shadow on the moon. But, maybe they've shown that, I don't know. Go ahead and pick somebody else.
Now, most of what you talk about is like relative days. Are there, do we think they tie to absolute days where we can?
Absolutely. The problem is, this is another major, you're getting me to air all the dirty laundry in. There is the thing that they call the calendar correlation problem. So yeah, if you have a Julian day number system in the Maya world, and you have a Julian day number system in the European world, can't you just line them up? And the problem is, nobody agrees. There's this convention that there's a family of correct calendar correlations, but every one of them is problematic. And the one that John Justison used to do his eclipse stuff is the least agreed upon version of that family. So it's just, I have an argument for one, but I don't want to go into that. I think my thing is that it becomes a crutch, right? If we immediately attach it to historical events, then we start looking at those historical events and then interpreting the culture accordingly. And I'm like, let's look at their culture, the way they produced it, and see what we can understand from it. And then try to align it with other things. Yes, sorry.
So just to clarify again, it sounds like you're saying perhaps they weren't documenting science as so much as documenting theology.
Thank you for that question. So I think, yes and no. I think in this document, they were doing something that was political and religious using science.
Using science.
But
that's a trend that we see.
But that's what?
That's a trend that we see where religion adopts scientific concepts to anchor what they're trying to convince people of.
Yeah, it's what David King, the historian of Islamic science, called science in the service of the state, right? I mean, you needed a patron, and Galileo needed a patron to do his astronomy, right? So you're serving them. We're seeing the application of it, but that also means that there is the science that had to have been done in other places in order to get mapped onto this, right? And we have this great archaeological find recently at Shultun, where we see an astronomer's workshop, where on the walls they painted their calculations, right? So we see these huge walls of painted numbers that are all related to 8 or 19-day count, lunar periods, long count dates. It's really fun. Yeah.
How about the Aztec? Did they follow up with this?
See, here's the problem, right? The Aztecs did not use the long count systems. So after the classic Maya period, people dropped that way of counting days, and so all of that robust approach to doing astronomy kind of fell away. So the post-classic, you don't see as much science, but you see a lot more internationalism. Like economics became a huge driver, and that's like empire and stuff. Yeah. You guys have been great. Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank you.
You did good, Doc. I've got something from you from the ancient Chumash tribe that is featured quite eloquently here. This is one of their hats. They wore it proudly. This, you'll carry your books on campus. Our official going out of business sale with our guys. And your incredible honorarium is in here. And our undying thanks for an incredible show. And just for the record books, start thinking about October when we have 2 incredible programs. 2nd and then 2 weeks later. Thank you. You want to declare the meeting closed? Oh yeah, meeting's over.